just went into the murder-suicide house on my street. Nothing had been touched since the bodies were removed nearly a year ago. Not even the mattress where the bodies sat decomposing for 6 weeks. Most of the neighbors on our street are friendly. We look out for each other. We text, chat, and say hello when we see one another, etc. It's a sweet feeling of community. In the past, there had only been one household that wasn't interested in being friendly with any of us. An elderly woman, mid-70s, we'll call her Maud, and her son, mid-50s, we'll call him Don. My partner and I had attempted to wave and say hello, only to be met with cold stares from them. Once my dog managed to slip out of his collar and run through their yard while Maud was out getting the mail. The glare I received from her while trying to catch the dog left me with a feeling hard to shake. You know that unexpected gut punch feeling when you become the object of a stranger's misery and hatred? Anyways, we learned quickly to stay out of her way. We barely ever saw Dawn. The blinds were always closed tight. They rarely left the house, and no one ever visited them. I last saw either of them at the beginning of August in 2021. Dawn was getting the mail while wearing blue latex gloves, which I thought was weird. In early October, one of our other neighbors reached out to ask if we had seen Maud or Dawn recently. We had not. Suddenly, we were all too aware that their grass was now over 3 feet tall, and that the mailbox was so full that it couldn't close anymore, and papers were literally spilling out into the street. Obviously, a welfare check was called. The neighbor who had put herself in charge of directly communicating with the police called shortly after the check and told us to sit down. Maud and Dawn were both dead and had been dead for 6 to 8 weeks. It appeared to be a murder-suicide, the assumption being that he killed her. I paced the rest of the day in front of my living room windows, watching the crime scene van pull up, the officers come in and out of the front door, taking breaks to somberly chat in the front yard. Then after a few hours, out came the body bags. This smell was something I had never experienced before and will never forget. The following weeks, I thought of how many times I had walked by that house with my son and dog, while 2 bodies were laying there rotting. I stayed up for hours a few nights trying to find out anything I could. Nothing. No news stories, no crime reports, absolutely nothing. So I dug into Maud's history. All I could find was that she had been buried in a field north of a town dedicated to the quote-unquote unclaimed. I kept a close watch on the house and researched the legal proceedings it would go through since there was no kin. Looking at that house had always felt cold and sad before, but now it felt dark too. Haunted. I became obsessed with Maud's story with no way of getting answers. Her house just staring back at me blankly every single day. Back in the spring, my young son and I were out catching fireflies. We would stand still, waiting for one to blink, and run in that direction. It took us up and down the street multiple times. I know this is such a small, silly detail, but that night, I stared into Maud's yards for minutes at a time, waiting to see a firefly, and I swear not a single firefly blinked over there. I became so bothered by it that I stared longer, sure that if I just stared long enough I would see one, but nothing. Complete stillness and darkness. I told my husband that I hoped someone would buy the property and knock the house down. No one had any business living there now. Today, around a year after they died, the doors were open and people I hadn't seen before were in and out, carrying bag after bag of what looked like junk. I texted a neighbor and asked for intel. He said the house and all of its belongings had been collectively sold and bought at an auction 2 weeks ago. These were the new owners, probably getting ready to flip the house. I typically don't shove myself into situations, but I had just spent way too much time thinking about Maud, wondering who she was, why she was so angry, imagining what strange life her and her son had been living, and what their last moments were like. I knew I'd regret it forever if I didn't ask them what it was like inside. So I did, and they invited me in. One step into the front door and more puzzle pieces fell into place. This was a hoarder home. There was barely anywhere to put my feet. Stacks on stacks of old fine china, pots and pans, vintage books and records, knickknacks and countless boxes filled with God knows what, from floor to ceiling, I kid you not. The woman who had led me inside said, "The mattress where it happened is still here. Do you want to see it?" Slightly afraid that she'd think I was completely demented, but far more curious, I said that, of course, I wanted to see it. She led me to a bedroom through piles and leaning stacks of junk. She walked into a cramped, small bedroom with a twin-sized bed and pulled the blankets back. If you've seen what decomposition stains look like, then you can imagine what I saw. After processing, I asked, "So this is where Maud was found?" "I think they were both in here. I'm trying to piece it all together. I haven't even started in the other corner bedroom, but I'm hoping it'll give me some answers. I'll be here organizing and sorting over the next few days. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." I told her that I would love nothing more, so after all of these months, I'm excited to have a chance to get some answers to everything I've been wondering, to get a sense of who Maud was, to possibly find a way to honor what seems to have been a very sad life, to maybe get some clues into why her son murdered her. Her son, who I found out shortly after seeing the house, was a deeply troubled sex offender who was charged by the FBI for CP and soliciting a minor in 2014, and to hopefully do it without any bad energy attaching itself to me. I do keep wondering, why, if this was a murder-suicide, did the police not do a deeper investigation? Is it because there was no kin to care? Anyone have insight? Part 2, Murder-Suicide House Update. I spent hours in that house yesterday. Hours, it's hard to even know where to begin. I walked out of my house, crossed the street, and went up the path to the front door where the woman I had previously talked with, Gwen, sat trying to Google the value of a piece of pottery that she had found. Find something good? I'm not sure. It's hard to know what's real and what isn't with this stuff. I walked past her and let myself in, praising her for the amount of junk she had managed to remove since my last time in the house. Mostly, though, I was trying to not seem rude as I made my way to the back bedrooms to immediately get to work. I walked past Maud's room, where the mattress covered in decomposed body fluids had been leaned up against the wall so no one had to look at it anymore. Of course, that didn't stop the smell. I looked into a bedroom I hadn't seen last time. It had obviously been Dawn's. Hundreds of books and men's shoes and hats and clothes covered the floor, almost climbing to the ceiling in some areas. "I think I'm just going to get started in here sorting through these bookshelves," Gwen said. "Yeah, sure, the smell isn't as bad in there." I poked around the room and made my way to a bathroom door in the corner. It was hard to tell at first because there were so many things on the floor, but I realized there was a discoloration of the wood floors near the bathroom. I stepped back, took a wider look, and said, "This is where Dawn died." If you recall, previously, Gwen had thought that they had both been found dead in Maud's room, but she looked, made a face, and said, "I think you're right." We attempted to clear the area and in doing so, uncovered pieces of cloth and towels and a pair of shoes turned rock hard with the long since dried dark brown red fluid. As we moved things aside, it became apparent that the dark markings in the floor made their way nearly 6 feet into the room from the bathroom door. Dawn. Well, I guess they died in separate rooms after all. And this definitely looks like the mess of a suicide. I shook it off and went to the floor of ceiling bookshelves that were next to a small bed and got to work with the trash bags for junk and totes for book sorting. This was truly one of the strangest experiences of my life. I sorted through what seemed to be Dawn's very few sentimental items. One Christmas letter from an old high school friend, postmarked years ago. Old printed film from what appeared to be his childhood. pornography, one stuffed animal elephant, his ID, social security card, vaccination card, and glasses. Most concerning, multiple pairs of incredibly high quality binoculars. Gwen and I went to both windows in the room to see what views he had. One looked at the side of another neighbor's house, the home of a family with 2 young girls, probably between the ages of 8 to 12. Gwen said Don did everyone a favor by taking care of himself. I felt sick and told her I'm now terrified of whoever I don't know in our neighborhood, anyone who might want my small son. Again, we shook it off and got back to work. I pulled playing cards out of the nearly 20 different books he had been in the middle of reading. He had a deck on the shelf next to his bed to use as bookmarks. Some books were fantasy, some history, some romance, some classics. Apparently he wasn't picky about his literature. After filling one large tote full of books, I sat there taking it all in, looking around the room, trying to get into Don's headspace a little. I noticed a calendar still hanging on the wall. It was turned to September 2021. If you recall, the last time I had seen either of them was early August 2021, and it had been mentioned that Maud had been dead for some time, 6 to 8 weeks. The stains and the smell in her room certainly hinted at as much. They were found October 6, 2021, but the dried blood in Dawn's room, the lack of strong smell. Gwen, did you find anything else in Maud's room? Any other clues as to how she died? I didn't. I looked too. Looked at the walls for splatter, at the mattress for bullet holes. Nothing. I'm suddenly wondering, what if he didn't kill Maud? What if she died of natural causes in her room, and he left her in there dead for a few weeks before deciding to take his own life in here? It would explain why it smells so much worse in her room. She would have had more time to rot. We ran the hypothesis by the older Southern couple who had actually bought the home. Well, I suppose he could have been playing with taking her social security checks, Roger mentioned. Another house we bought, the wife had put her dead husband in the pond in the backyard and hadn't reported it so she could keep getting his checks. They never did recover his body. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this something you all do often? I laughed, but was genuinely curious. The wife laughed too. We do buy estates often, but we don't do this often. Referring to the unattended deaths, the smell, and the insane level of hoarding, I'm sure. I think that's all I have the mental capacity for tonight. But hopefully I'll be able to write up more tomorrow. And hopefully with a police report in hand so we can have some certain answers. I won't be able to stop thinking about this until I have Maud and Dawn's autopsy reports. This is probably the creepiest, most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. I used to work overnight as a security guard at the local port. Usually none of the port workers would stay overnight except for the safety official. I wouldn't be on the shift alone since the site has a radius of nearly 2 miles. Overnight, usually there would be 3 guards, including me. Since the area was fairly big, there were different posts, but front gate was the main entrance area where all of the guards would be stationed overnight, since there was no need to put them in other posts due to the fact that there was no activity in the site at this time. The veteran guards that have been there for years would often say that the site was haunted, given the fact that there had been accidents and deaths that occurred in the area a long time ago. I was aware that people died there due to freak accidents, and I do believe in angels and demons since I'm actually a religious person, but I always thought that the superiors were just messing with us new guys. I would work 5 to 6 nights out of the week, and for the first few weeks, I never really saw or heard anything out of the ordinary, except for maybe a few questionable creaks and seeing the occasional misplaced object while doing my patrol rounds. But nothing too crazy. Just to describe the setting for you, this is a fairly big site, and on occasions when there were big projects being constructed at the port, the workers would sometimes stay overnight. Due to the fact that there were times where port workers were required to stay at the port for a few days, there's a gym in the site for their convenience. This gym is fairly old. In the gym, there's a sauna, weights, and even a racquetball court. If you don't know what a racquetball court is, it's similar to an indoor tennis court with thin plastered walls and thick glass doors. Usually on our patrol rounds, me and one of the other guards, Mike, would stop by the gym and play a few rounds of racquetball before returning back to the front gate. On one of those nights, me and Mike decided to hit a full workout instead of playing racquetball in the cage. This is around 2:30 in the morning, and the entire building is so quiet that you can hear the electricity running through the lights. The air conditioner is off, and so is everything else. The only thing that's running are the lights. 15 to 20 minutes into the workout, we hear a loud thump. We crossed it off as nothing and continued working out. Then, after a few more minutes, we heard the loud thump once more. At first we thought it was our lieutenant, which could have been walking around, but then we radioed him and he gave us his location, which was front gate. We tried thinking logically on what could be making those loud thumps on the wall. They were coming from the court on the other side. We thought it was the air conditioner, but then we remembered that it was off, and even when it switched on during the day, there's no reports of thumps coming from the air conditioner. After a few more minutes, the thumps started occurring one right after the other. We were very creeped out at this point, but what we were about to witness still scares the absolute shit out of me to this day. We started to approach the other side of the gym to where the glass door was. We turned on the flashlight, aimed it towards the clear glass door, and I got chills all over my body, and I started tearing so much out of fear that I was about to cry. We saw one of the balls rolling slowly by itself inside the court, but there was no one in there. So that means the loud thumps were the balls mysteriously being tossed against the wall, as if someone or something was playing inside the cage. We were both so confused and frightened to how this was really happening. We couldn't make sense of any of it. We were scared shitless, and we started yelling and running away because we knew that there was probably something evil toying with us right there. As we sprinted full speed back to the front gate, the lieutenant saw us and asked us why we were tearing up and running in such a ridiculous manner. We told him what we witnessed, and his facial expression scared us even more. That's when he said, "That's why there's always guards that quit often. There's something evil in the area, and it's not the first time that something really bad has happened here." He then showed us security footage of dark figures and shadows literally passing through the office areas, and lights mysteriously switching on and off. Up until this day, I still get chills recounting my experience with my friends and family, and I'm even getting chills right now as I'm typing this. I'd never had a real encounter with the supernatural until that night. Many say that it was a demonic presence messing around with us. Others say it was a ghost of a dead person who died in the area. I don't know what it was, but I didn't last long in the job after that. There were other experiences, but I'll share them at another time. I used to work nights at a gas station. There would typically be long periods when no one was in the store between 2 and 5 in the morning. So I would often sit in the office where the screens for the security cameras were. I caught a glimpse of a man wearing a pair of jeans and worker boots walking around on the camera. But when I peeked out into the store, no one was there. I thought maybe I was just tired and brushed it off. The next night, I again saw what looked like a man wandering around, but no one was there. When the manager came in later that morning, I told her about it, and she very casually said, "Yeah, I know. I'm actually surprised he didn't talk to you." She told me about how people had quit or refused to work the night shift because they would see and hear things. She said almost everyone would talk about an older man with jeans and boots, and that they typically saw him walking around the back of the store. I'd really like to know what was there before it was a gas station. One day when I was an elementary schooler, I think probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mom in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept. And now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to get on the school bus. School started at 8 a.m. and my bus pickup time was 7 a.m. But it was already like 6:40 or something, and I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even had breakfast yet. So my mom decided that today we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead. She would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm just sitting there at the dining room table eating breakfast, still in my pajamas, and it's now about 6:50. We hear the bus pull up, about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. There's a knock at the door, and my mom opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular driver called in sick. He says he knows he's a few minutes early since he wanted to get an early start on the route since he didn't know it well. My mom explains to him that she was going to take me to school since we woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says that he can wait a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mom insists that no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast and still don't have my school clothes on at this point. But at 7 in the morning sharp, another bus pulls up to my house. My mom thinks this is weird and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about it and tells me to finish getting ready for school. At the time, I didn't know what happened, but my mom would end up telling me a few years later. When she went to the second bus, she found out that it was being driven by my regular bus driver, and it was full of all the other kids that usually are on the route. The other bus was empty, by the way. My mom asked the driver about the substitute driver and about him calling in sick. I never called in sick, and there's no substitute driver on my route, he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go inside and call the police, which she did without me knowing, and report this incident. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again. Not even if someone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, had I gotten on that bus, I would have never made it to school or back home. And if my mom hadn't overslept on that specific day, I would have been on that bus. I was 8 or 9 at the time. I was an extremely skinny, small little girl for my age. I hung out at the very bottom of the height and weight charge at the doctor's office. Adults would often mistake me for a child of 6, which I absolutely hated. It was summertime and my mom was home making lunch. I asked to go ride my bike. The rule was not around the block, just to the corner and back. We lived in a very small, quiet town on the street that hardly ever had traffic unless it was the neighbors coming and going. My corner was about 8 houses down from my own house. I was cruising along on my new bike and I didn't quite hit the bumpy spot in the sidewalk correctly and I crashed pretty hard. I was laying there all twisted around with my bike shaking. My helmet had fallen off because I never buckled the bottom strap to be cool. I felt all shaky and then I worried I'd get in trouble for not buckling my helmet strap, assuming my mom saw me. Maybe 30 seconds passed and a car drove up to me at the corner. I heard a car stop and a man's voice say, "Oh honey, are you okay?" I was trying not to cry at this point. I look up expecting a neighbor and I see a stranger. This man looked dirty and you could see all kinds of garbage all inside his car. The garbage was right up to all the windows and the car was rusty. He had pulled his car right over in such a way that he was almost right on the sidewalk in front of me. He had stayed in his car, but he was leaning way out of his driver's side window and his door was a little open looking at me. He then said, "Come on, I'll take care of you." I lied and I said I wasn't hurt. He got angry with me and said he'd just take me home. I remembered thinking, where would I sit? I said to him, "I'm not hurt." Then he said, "If you're not hurt, you have to prove it." So I took all my strength and I untangled my legs and stood up. Then the man gave me a terrible, angry look and peeled out and disappeared. I was so scared I took my shaky legs and I ran home crying. I left my helmet and my bike laying there. I told my mother what had happened and she walked down and grabbed my bike and helmet after lunch. As an adult, I asked her if she remembered that incident. She told me that when she walked to the corner to grab my things, she saw the tire tracks right up to the sidewalk. The car had pulled way over across where I must have fallen, and it also blocked me from view of anyone else driving by. She thought maybe the man would have kidnapped me, but she wasn't sure. I was told that he probably just wanted to help. Then I was told again to not talk to strangers. If I need help, then I can only talk to a mommy with kids. I think that dirty-looking man wanted to take me. He probably saw what he thought was a 5 or 6-year-old and was disappointed when I wasn't young enough and hurt enough to easily get picked up. Still creeps me out thinking how angry he got at me. If he'd been a tiny bit nicer, I might not be alive today. I was always an extremely small and sickly child. I looked young for my age. My family and I lived out of town, about 8 miles out. Our little community was next to a highway. The school bus would drop me off 2 blocks away from home. One day, I noticed a red truck following slowly behind me. So slow that I figured they were just looking for a house or something. I ignored it and walked to my house. That was the end of that. Consistently, this truck would follow slowly behind me. After a couple days of this, I walked into my house. I was always the first one home and looked out the window. Inside was an older man in a black lab. He was staring at me, idling inside his truck. Then he pulled away. I decided enough was enough. I told my parents. Of course, my sister was quick to jump in that I was lying. I had a habit of telling stories, but my mom thankfully believed me. She drove me to the bus stop the next morning. The red truck was there, across the street at the gas station, pointing toward the bus. I got on the bus and my mom decided to drive around the truck. She described the scene. The man was disheveled and dirty, hunched over in his seat just staring at the bus. His license plates were caked in mud, so she couldn't make them out. It freaked her out so much that she called the police and the school. I went to school and was quickly pulled into the office. The man had been spotted at the school, waiting in his truck. That day I rode the bus home. This time the truck was parked alongside the street. I would have to walk past this man's driver's side door to get home. I debated, considered running for it. Apparently, this man was getting desperate now that he was spotted. A police car showed up and I talked to the policeman. They went to go talk to the man. He quickly pulled away from the curb and took off down the highway. Never saw him again, and I don't believe he was ever caught. Because of this experience, I'm extremely guarded and paranoid with my own daughter and her soon-to-be sibling. The world is a terrifying place these days, and children go missing so easily. I don't like to think about it if I had been grabbed. I wouldn't be here typing this. My kids wouldn't exist. Well, I was lucky. Many children aren't. When I was like 6 years old, I attended the elementary school which was located in our small town. My way to and from school was basically just 500 meters off the main road, before turning into the street where I lived.
At the time, we're talking about the late 90s here, all the parents in the town were extremely adamant on telling their kids not to trust or follow strangers. Never to get into anybody's car, even if they say they know your parents and are friends. The reason why, there was a murder like 3 years back in the same town. A girl, not even 6 years old, was found dead and sexually assaulted in a field. The strange thing about it is, nobody knows how exactly she was taken. No signs of forced entry or something, which implied somebody lured her somewhere without her suspecting a thing. The case still hasn't been solved more than 20 years later. So our parents were very afraid that their kid was going to be next, because kids can be really stupid and you can't watch them 24/7. Now, on to what happened to me. I was walking home from elementary school. About halfway home, at the shadiest and mostly covered by trees and bushes area, a car pulled up next to me. A blonde, about 30-ish woman was the driver. She told me she could drive me home. She claimed to be going in the direction anyway, which was unclear to me at the time, essentially bullshit because once the road ends near my house, there's nothing but empty fields. Being a kid and not being suspicious at all, I said, "Oh no, it's not that far, I can walk." Then she started being more insistent. The whole time, "Oh, come on, it's fine, nothing to worry about, and you can relax instead of walking," kind of thing. The alarm bells only started ringing when she said she knew my mother. They were friends, and supposedly she was asked by her to drive me home. Thank God for my parents repeatedly talking about the tricks that people use to lure you in. I started being creeped out, continued to walk, but she kept driving beside me. Now, the real weird part in hindsight was her next attempt to get me into the car. She started saying that I was obviously afraid, and cool children are not afraid of such things. If you want to be cool, you should just relax. Honestly, I did not fully realize the full extent of the situation. I just felt uncomfortable and wanted to get out of the conversation. So I just started sprinting the rest of the way back to my house. Once I got home, I stayed right next to my door and kept looking outside the window for a few minutes. And guess who drove by and basically checked out the house? The creepy woman. The road was a dead-end road, and only after 3 more minutes the car came back the same way. It took years until I realized what kind of bullet I dodged there. All I was thinking was, my parents told me not to do this. I didn't know why or what the woman wanted. The drill of hearing over and over again not to believe strangers or get into their car kicked in. When I was older and started to get into true crime, I remembered this whole thing for the first time in 2 decades. Then I realized, holy shit, that woman was most likely sent as the trustworthy front woman to lure kids into their car and take off. She could have been doing this for some crazed pedo or human trafficking ring. Moral of the story is, even if your kids are too stupid or young like I was to comprehend such things, the rules of not following strangers, and the fact that strangers will lie to you for evil intentions, must be drilled into your child's head like watching both ways when crossing the road.
This happened to me 11 years ago. It's by far the most extreme and life-threatening situation I've been in. The eyewitness account you're about to read is 100% true, and it's mine. For some understanding, this happened in the United States. It was the summer of 2012. My longtime boyfriend and I had recently gotten married. Even though we were dirt poor college students and lived in a dinky apartment, we were having a blast. That particular summer, we gathered with our friends at the local movie theater almost every weekend. There was one just down the street from our apartment that had really cheap movie tickets. A night out that was under $10 was certainly within our budget. Anyway, one Thursday night I received a call from this group of friends inviting us to watch the midnight premiere of the newest Batman movie. I had just finished working a 12-hour shift and was pretty tired. I almost refused the invitation and thought of crashing in my apartment instead. However, I didn't want to miss out on the fun, and it was a movie I'd wanted to see for a while anyway. Certainly, it wouldn't do any harm to stay up later than usual and miss a few hours of sleep, right? At 10:30 p.m., we met at the theater. We passed large cardboard cutouts of Catwoman and Batman as we walked inside, greeted by the smell of buttery popcorn and the chatter of excited moviegoers. The ticket booth was to the right of the entrance, and just above that was an electronic list of movies being played. The 12 a.m. showing of The Dark Knight Rises was displayed up there in bright red letters. Being paranoid that tickets might sell out quickly, one of my friends swung by earlier that day and purchased tickets for all of us. We bypassed the ticket line and went straight to the ticket taker. She smiled at us and kindly directed us to Theater 9, which was on the right side of the lobby. If only I had known what I do now, that among the crowds a killer was lurking, that as I walked across that tacky red and purple carpet towards Theater 9, I could have been walking to my death. I think about it often now, what I would have done had I known. Pulled the fire alarm, called the police, screamed for people to run away. But of course, I had no way of knowing what was about to happen. Oblivious to the peril I was putting myself in, I pushed open the doors for Theater 9, without giving it a second thought. The hallway in this theater was shaped like a U, and you could either go left or right. Theater 9 was the largest screening room in the building, perfect for accommodating the crowds that midnight premieres brought in. The screen was motionless and gray. Not even the previews had started yet because there was still a good hour and a half to go until the movie actually started. We entered on the right side, so all the seats were to our left. I remember being surprised at just how packed the theater already was. Just about every seat was filled, much to our dismay. At first, it seemed like we wouldn't find a spot to sit together. Now, the way this theater was set up, there was a section of seats right in front of the screen. This area was flat, and there were about 5 rows of seating in this section. A lot of seats in that section were empty, but sitting right in front of the movie screen sucks and none of us wanted to sit there. One of my friends then spotted a row with 5 empty seats all next to each other, perfect for the amount of people we had. These seats were about 3 to 4 rows up from where the seating rows start to elevate. We ran up the stairs before someone could take the seats and filed in. My husband, Brock, sat in the 5th seat. I sat next to him, and my friend Samantha sat next to me on my right side. Her boyfriend Tommy sat next to her, and another friend named Leo sat in the aisle seat. We spent the next several minutes casually chatting, joking around and laughing. After a while, my 3 friends went to the lobby to buy drinks and that addicting movie theater popcorn. While they were gone, Brock and I passed the time by people watching. The theater was bright since the lights weren't dimmed yet, and I could see everyone clearly. There were a lot of people dressed in Batman t-shirts and hoodies. One person even had a mask and one of those shirts with an attached cape. There were a lot of kids in attendance as well, which wasn't surprising because even though it was a Thursday night, it was summer vacation, so that meant no school the next day. Of all the people I saw, the person I will never forget was the little girl sitting in our same row a few chairs away. She was really cute, blonde with blue eyes, and passed us several times on her way to the lobby, each time coming back with various snacks and popcorn. Overall, people seemed very excited to see the movie, and the room was filled with energy and laughter. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the lights started to dim and the previews began. Just like every movie I've seen before, a quick animation flashed across the screen, reminding us to get refreshments from the lobby. We were already devouring that popcorn like ravenous animals. To silence our cell phones and to make sure we know where the emergency exits are. The animation had this ugly CGI cat in a tuxedo that was sitting in a movie theater. I casually glanced at the bright green emergency exit signs that were on the left and right sides of the movie screen. I didn't think much of the reminder, like usual. After that, I only remember one preview for The Man of Steel. The others I'm not sure what they were about. When the movie started, the theater erupted into cheering and clapping. The title of the movie, The Dark Knight Rises, exploded onto the screen. This was followed by the scene where Bane is hijacking a plane. I thought this scene was pretty cool and it caught my interest right away. Only when the movie started to get a little less interesting did I remember just how tired I was. I decided I would close my eyes at the more boring parts to get a little bit of rest. I had been awake for 20 hours at that point, so I was rightfully sleepy. My eyes were closed for most of the duration of Batman and Catwoman's encounter. I don't really remember what was going on in that part of the movie. Perhaps some of you have seen it and know what I'm talking about. Anyway, when I opened my eyes again, Bruce Wayne was on his computer digging up information on Catwoman. This is the last scene I saw. I never got to watch the rest of the movie. All of a sudden, a loud bang erupted from the left side of the theater. I sort of screamed a little because it startled me. A strange smell started to fill the auditorium. It was like the smell of a firework, so I thought it was a cherry bomb or something similar. Had someone thrown fireworks into the crowd as a prank? Then, down near the right side of the movie screen, the dark silhouette of a person caught my attention. They were just a black frame against the bright movie screen. A series of flashing lights was coming from this person. It was a weird moment where the time literally slowed down and everything went strangely quiet. I was completely frozen, unable to move, and really unable to think at all. It was like my brain had stopped working entirely. Brock caught on immediately to what was happening and he grabbed me. He pulled me to the ground and laid on top of me, shielding me with his own body. At this point, time and sound returned to me. I could hear the gunshots ringing out across the theater. People were screaming. The movie was still playing on top of it all, creating a chaotic explosion of sound. I realized the flashing lights I had seen were bullets flying out of a gun barrel. An instant sensation of adrenaline flooded my body. There was absolutely nothing I could do except lay there and hope to God that the bullets I heard ripping through seats and walls wouldn't go through me too. At one point, shrapnel hit my head, cutting off a good chunk of my hair, and as I reached for the spot to make sure it wasn't bleeding, hot pieces of metal fell into my hand. I was lying face up so I could see everything that was happening. The lights from a still playing movie danced across the ceiling and walls. My friends were on the floor with me. Our unfinished buckets of popcorn were spilled all across the floor. Leo had his legs sticking out into the aisle because there wasn't enough room for him to hide completely behind the seats. At some point, Samantha's water bottle, which had been in the cup holder between our seats, exploded. Water splashed all over my face. The smell of gun smoke was overwhelming. Riot-grade tear gas made me cry and caused me to cough uncontrollably. There was another smell too. The horrible metallic smell of blood that I'll never forget. I remember my lower body feeling wet all of a sudden. For some reason, I thought this came from the leaking water bottle, but I soon realized this wasn't the case. All of a sudden, things went strangely quiet. The bullets had stopped for some reason. Tommy shouted, "Let's get out of here." We took advantage of the opportunity and made a run for it. We ran down the stairs, across the front of the screen towards a bright green exit sign. We crammed into a small closet-like space where the door was. It was so dark we had a hard time finding it. We were screaming and slamming on the walls to find the door, blinded by the tear gas and dumbfounded by shock. Then finally, my hands felt the metal door handle and I pushed against it with all my strength. The door flew open and the light of a nearby streetlight flooded our eyes. We pushed against the door so hard that we all fell over onto the concrete. Samantha lost her pink flip-flops just outside the doorway. As I scrambled to my feet and literally ran for my life, I realized my legs were red, absolutely soaked with blood. It was like I dipped my legs into a bathtub full of it. I checked my body all over and realized I wasn't injured at all. Where had this blood come from? I looked behind me and realized that the blood was my husband's. He had been shot in the leg. A massive, gaping hole had ripped through the lower half of Brock's right leg. His foot was barely hanging on and dangled lifelessly.
Leo and a young man I didn't recognize were carrying Brock because, after falling outside the door, he lost all his strength and couldn't walk. I was completely shocked. I had no idea he had been injured, especially since he was right behind me the whole time and managed to escape the theater all by himself. How he did it on one foot, I'll never know. At this point, I screamed. My scream was so loud that it already alerted nearby construction workers. At the back of the theater, there was a narrow parking lot, followed by a grassy lawn and then the street beyond that. The construction workers were doing road repair on the street, but as soon as they heard my scream and saw us running, they stopped working and watched what was going on. I'm not sure why this is such a vivid part of my memory. Anyway, they carried Brock along the back sidewalk all the way to the end, where the corner of the building is. This was quite a distance, several dozen feet. My husband then collapsed from exhaustion and pain, saying he couldn't move anymore. He lay down, and a puddle of blood started to form beneath him. I looked back and realized we had left a trail of blood leading from the door all the way to our current position. I was trembling. I knelt beside Brock and glanced around to see who else was injured. Tommy had been shot in the knee and the hip and was further away in the parking lot. The teenager who helped my husband was also injured. His dad and mom were with him. His mom was sitting against the wall and looked like she was going to pass out. She was bleeding from several places. That family escaped at the same time we did. I guess they heard the bullet stop and decided to make a run for it, too. We were all lucky because the shooting was still going on inside. I had to take off my shirt and use it to stop the bleeding. I'll never forget how lifeless and limp his leg felt. And I imagined that's what a dead body must feel like. I got blood all over my hands and arms. The police showed up really fast. I'd say we were only outside for a minute or two before the red and blue sirens filled the night and rushed to our location. We were literally a block away from the police station. A female officer stood by us the whole time until paramedics arrived, which took a very long time. Brock was one of the last to be taken to a hospital. He was bleeding out for almost 20 minutes before an ambulance pulled up on the same street with the road work. At this point, he had become almost unresponsive and was on the verge of unconsciousness. Several massive guys rushed across the grass with a stretcher, loaded him onto it, and then ran with him back to the waiting ambulance. I wasn't able to go with them because there was another injured person in the ambulance, and it was too crowded. I wandered around to the front of the theater alone, unsure of where my friends had went. My blood-stained shirt and a pool of blood were left behind on the corner of that sidewalk. Walking through the crowds felt like a dream. I couldn't believe what had just happened. People were in hysterics and crying. A lot of people, such as me, were covered in blood. And, like me, I'm pretty sure the blood staining their skin and clothes wasn't their own. A lot of people seemed to notice how lonely and dazed I looked. So they kept me company and even offered me a ride to the different hospitals to find Brock, because I hadn't been told what hospital he was taken to. I hung around those people for a while as police swarmed the area and asked us what we saw inside the theater. The whole parking lot was on lockdown, and we weren't going to be allowed to leave anytime soon. It was around 2 a.m., so it was very dark outside still, and I was pretty cold, wearing only an undershirt and shorts. The flashing red and blue lights of what seemed like 100 police cars were blinding. I remember seeing a big police vehicle pull up, said something like Crime Scene Investigation Unit on it. I think that's when it really sank in and hit me. I started to get sick to my stomach and wanted to vomit, but somehow I was able to hold it back. Eventually, police started letting people leave. I jumped into my truck and booked it out of there. I was in such a state of panic that I didn't even think to go back to my apartment, grab my cell phone, which I had forgotten, and call my parents or someone else to help me. I was angry, upset, scared, and most of all, still in a state of shock. Was I really going to lose Brock only a month shy of our first wedding anniversary because of some psychopath with a gun? Thankfully, by the time dawn rolled around, I found the hospital he was treated in. This was in the next city over, maybe 45 minutes from the theater if you're going the speed limit. I was so happy to be there, and the hospital staff were so welcoming and understanding. After making sure I wasn't injured as well, they let me wait in the ICU room that Brock would be placed in when he was done recovering from surgery. I was so glad he was alive. Brock and Tommy both had survived, though many others weren't so lucky. I found out the following day, after some much-needed sleep on a hospital couch, that 12 people were killed in this shooting and over 70 were injured. I remember they first thought 15 people were killed, but the real number was 12. The little blonde girl sitting in my row did not survive. She died in the theater no more than a few feet from us. She had been shot multiple times. A heartbroken police officer who cried during his court testimony tried unsuccessfully to save her by carrying her out of the theater and having her sent to a hospital. Tommy was rushed to a different hospital in the back of a police car. He underwent surgery and made a full recovery. The bullet missed his hip bone and narrowly missed his urinary tract and bladder. According to the surgeons, my husband lost almost half his blood. Brock made it to the hospital just in time. Any later and he would have died. He underwent several blood transfusions and was in the hospital for 21 days. The wound to his leg was severe enough that they had to amputate it after trying unsuccessfully to save it. It's been so long since the shooting happened that my husband, friends, and I have been able to recover from it somewhat. The event was pretty horrifying and has left us scarred for sure. I wouldn't consider that part of the story to be creepy though. No, the creepy part is the shooter himself. I later learned much about him from the murder trial that I would follow in the coming years. Though my encounter with this man was very brief, he has affected my life greatly. Just to know that people like this exist is disturbing. He is certainly one twisted individual that I never want to see again. I learned everything from watching the televised trial that took place in early 2015. This guy was going to school for neuroscience or something in California. I guess he was a pretty smart guy. However, for some reason, he had an obsession with killing people and had a stalker mentality. After dropping out of his university, he moved to my state and chose my local theater to commit a mass shooting. Before that, he was planning on hiding along remote hiking trails up in the mountains, jumping people, pulling them into the woods and killing them there, though he never went through with that idea. He stalked my theater for months and had the shooting all planned out for the night of July 20th. Though I never saw him before this, it's unnerving to think this guy could have been watching us every time we went to the theater, and we would have never known it. We were completely unaware of what he had planned against us. This completely ruined my sense of security because who knows what the stranger next to you is planning to do to you. I came very close to the shooter, but I never actually saw his face in person until I was forced to testify in court. Of course, I saw his mugshots on television, but while in the theater, I only saw him as a dark silhouette in the shadows, like a demonic figure rendered from the darkest and most sinister nightmare. He was even in the hallway that we passed upon running for the emergency exit. The only thing stopping him from killing us there and then was his jammed assault rifle. In order to commit this crime, he ordered a few thousand rounds of ammunition, riot gear and armor, tear gas, an assault rifle, and a shotgun. He took pictures of himself, which were shown in court, wearing all of this gear like some sick trophy and holding up these weapons with a menacing smile. He dyed his hair orange and put in these creepy black contacts while making devilish faces into the camera. Something that made me sick just looking at it. Before driving to the theater with all of his gear in his car, he booby-trapped his entire apartment and set it to explode if anyone opened the door. Then, once at the theater, he posed as a moviegoer and even bought a ticket for the movie. I think his ticket had Theater 8 on it, which was next door, but Theater 9 had more people on it, so he went into number 9 instead. He was in the front rows. I must have passed him several times in the lobby while he was just there. Maybe he had seen me too. At some point during the movie, he got up and went through the side exit, which didn't have an alarm for some reason. Kept it propped open with something. Then went to his car to put on all his armor and grabbed his weapons. Then he came back inside and started shooting. When we escaped the theater, we ran past his white car, which was parked right at the exit. We didn't even notice it. At some point, he came outside, and he would have seen us there on the concrete. I don't know what stopped him from shooting people that were outside too, but he could have easily ended us there and then if he wanted to. I think the hardest part for me was facing this twisted individual in court. I'll never forget Rising, as they called my name, walking down the center row past my family, other survivors, and crowds of news-hungry media personnel. I sat right across from him, maybe only 10 feet away. While his orange hair was gone and he wasn't wearing any black contacts anymore. Being so close to him was a creepy and uncomfortable experience. My encounters with this man are certainly ones I'll never forget. I can now say that I've come face to face with a true deranged psychopath. He just had this blank stare in his eyes the whole time. If eyes truly are the windows to the soul, then his soul was filled with nothing but a cold indifference for those he had murdered and harmed. He wouldn't even look at me. Sitting across from him in court was the second time I had knowingly been in the same room with this man. A man who had tried to take my life but thankfully failed. A man who would end up spending forever behind bars when, at the end of it all, he was sentenced to 3,318 years in prison for his crimes. This is to the man who tried to kill me. The man who caused countless nightmares and fueled the fires of my paranoia. The man who hurt my friends and family, causing years of untold grief for my husband because he will never walk the same again. The man who stole the innocence and joy from a 6-year-old child who went into that theater alive and came out dead. To the man who carried out the worst mass shooting in Colorado history. I hope you rot in prison.
Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to the island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island, drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small, at about 975 acres, it has had an interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part they lived peacefully together on the island. By the 1640s, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi had left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to talk to one of these new settlers, or even find where they were living. It was around this time that strange things started to happen in the village. Several animals, to not mention what they were, maybe it was pigs or chickens kept by the settlers, were found slaughtered in the village and seemed to have been used to make markings in blood on some of the buildings in the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers felt that these things must have been done by these new people on the island, and they intended to find them, but after a thorough search of the island, including the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported back that, quote-unquote, the material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are of the best quality, and that the work is done in a substantive and workmanlike manner. David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19, 1837. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of construction of the lighthouse, David Corbin started to complain that plaster started to fall off the building, and some sort of liquid would ooze through the cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some have said when visiting him that he would stare at a certain wall and sometimes spoke vaguely of the other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strange. The official report says that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to, quote-unquote, find a wife, to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by Corbin's mental state caused by years of solitude and thought it would be best that he spent some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that had visited the new keeper say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he had seen. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or a family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote a terrible storm came up shortly after their departure, and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3rd, 1876, Betts wrote, "The 2 men who were lost last January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jacksonport. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account, they were still adrift. There is not much hope that they will be found and buried." By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thorderson, purchased all of the island except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thorderson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store Thorderson's immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumored that he possessed some very rare books on the occult in his collection. Thorderson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. However, I couldn't find any writings from Thorderson that mentioned him experiencing anything strange on the island. After his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his book collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they had to purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history is hard to find on the internet, but there are a couple binders in the Great Hall that has a lot of this documented. Thorderson's personal papers are housed in the archive section of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. All of this history I gave is just to provide a little context for experiences I have had, directly or indirectly, on Rock Island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I'd booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that is a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery, and took a couple breaks just due to how heavy my pack was. I was definitely packed more for camping than hiking. I got to my site, set up my tent, got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so I could start a fire. On my third trip back from the beach, before I got back to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stopped in my tracks and waited for a good 30 seconds, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping sites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there are probably 100 yards between each side. There is not a real trail connecting the three sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the three sites that there's an obvious path. As I was setting some sticks up in my fire ring, something caught my eye and I looked up. Fairly far away, it looked like it might have been at Site D or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not even really a trail they were on. Then my mind just went to, there must be something wrong and this person needs help. They got a little closer, and it looked like maybe it was a woman in loose gray clothes, maybe in a hoodie. It was still far enough that I couldn't really make out any details. I quickly stood up from the crouching position I was in, and just as I did, I heard that high-pitched squeal noise again. It was behind me, and it was much closer this time. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around to look behind me and scanned the trees for a couple seconds, but I didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around because I knew the running person must be getting close, but now they were gone. Again, I stood there and scanned the trees, but did not see them anywhere. I was so confused. I was kind of frozen for a few seconds. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out of my head that it was just a fellow camper from Site C or D that was maybe running to the pit toilet that was a couple 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it, but it was really just bothering me. I did not like whatever that squeal noise was, and I just felt like it was strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple adult beverages, then decided to take a little walk. I did see the path that led from the site to the main trail and the pit toilet, so that did make me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe someone from Site C that took a strange way to get to the main trail by going through Site D. It didn't make a ton of sense because I probably still should have seen them, but it made me feel better. I continued on to Site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I just thought I would go over with the excuse that I would introduce myself as a camping neighbor from Site E and see if anyone looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came up on the site and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they would have been the person I saw running. I introduced myself and they introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s. They were nice and both seemed to be pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or the squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear and I was just staring up and looking at millions of stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. At around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up by a huge boom of thunder. It started downpouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through and I was starting to worry. The wind was whipping at my tent and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in a tent and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became just a light, steady drizzle. I was just starting to fall back asleep when I heard the squeal noise again. I opened my eyes, wide in the dark, and just laid there silent. There was another louder squeal noise, and it was pretty close. I knew there are no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are deer and porcupines, but nothing like bear or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel better, though. There was just something about that squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best I could describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. I honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent and started to hear footsteps outside my tent. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried in the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like a somewhat large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife I had out just to feel better. In my head, I just kept saying, "You know, it's just an animal. It's fine. There's nothing in these woods that can hurt you." I listened as the footsteps started moving away from my tent. I just sat there being still, holding my knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. I started thinking to myself, it's fine. It was just an animal, you're being stupid, and you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal, and it was right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped, and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard my entire body was pulsing, and I felt it in my ears. It took everything in me, but I forced out a "get out of here." Not shouting, but as stern and mean sounding as I could at that moment. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night, but I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I laid down. Eventually, the rain stopped and I kept laying there until the sun came up. All that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out of my tent to relieve myself. As soon as I stepped outside my tent, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I surprisingly calmly thought, okay, this is enough. I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings and nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown the table over during the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over, but that might have made sense. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat, started to feel better about the whole thing, then decided to go for a hike. I admit I get easily scared when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. After I had some coffee and food, and the sun came out, I realized that nothing I heard or saw was really anything that couldn't be explained. Other than not getting a good night's sleep, I was having a pretty good time. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike the 7-mile Thorderson's Loop Trail that has a lot of interesting things to see, and I was excited to start the hike. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery where 2 sisters and a few others were buried. It's believed there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These likely are some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There's one by the beach, and that's where Chester Thorderson is buried. There's one on the eastern part of the island, where the 2 sisters are buried. And there's one on the northern part of the island, where the original lighthouse keeper, David E. Corbin, is buried. There's also at least one Potawatomi burial area on the island, but no one knows exactly where that is. I kept walking on the trail until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench where I sat down and drank some water. I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. I started to hear some talking on the trail ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer, and I could tell that they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place what language it might have been. Both voices were very, very deep and guttural. Then, back deep in the woods, I heard a loud and quick, "Ooh." Immediately, both voices I was listening to, with their own "ooh." I kind of smiled because it sounded like these two heard whatever it was in the woods, and they were trying to be funny and mock it by responding. I got off the bench, put my backpack back on, and started walking in the direction further down the trail where the voices were coming from, but I never found these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin is buried. I took a self-guided tour of the Potawatomi Lighthouse. I passed the wooden gate that apparently used to be part of a larger structure. I walked by the Great Hall and the dock area from where I arrived on the island. Visited some of the other structures on the island. Came across the cemetery where Chester Thorderson is buried. Then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see. It wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to Campsite C to ask the couple I spoke with the night before how they did with the storm during the night, but they had packed up and left already. I was disappointed because I also really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed since I had so little sleep the night before. I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I woke up suddenly and was immediately fully alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this part is a little hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I felt like there was something in the tent with me, and I could feel that it was angry, seething with anger, rageful even, and I could even feel its hatred for me. It felt like something very bad was about to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and it got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but I couldn't because I was frozen. I'd never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forward at nothing, just frozen. And the weird thing is, I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was like my brain telling me that whatever's about to happen, even if it's death, will at least be a relief. Then I passed out. At least I have to assume I passed out. That's all I remember until I woke up at 8 a.m. that morning. When I woke up, I was laying outside of my sleeping bag, on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back with my left leg straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was up against my left knee. My heart started pounding, but I kept thinking to myself, it was a dream. I'm leaving right now. It was a dream. I'm leaving right now. I packed up everything very quickly and started back toward the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until about 10:30 in the morning, I had to kill a little time around the Great Hall and dock area. I wanted to get off the island so bad, but I did feel a little better just being out of the woods and just being able to see other people. I sat down on a bench a little to the east of the dock and lit a cigar just to give me something to do while trying not to think about the night before. I was sitting a few minutes about, scanning out over the water, when I was startled by someone behind me saying, "Hey!" I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and just came over to ask if you had a lighter." I felt like an idiot and told him that's fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and was kind of zoned out, and I handed him my lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back to me. We started talking about the usual things you might talk about. He said he was from the Madison area. We talked about the storms we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy, and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice, normal conversation, and kind of took my mind off the night I just had for a little bit. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then naturally, he asked me what site I'd been staying at. I told him I was staying at Site E the last 2 nights, and he said he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he had booked Site D the last 2 nights. I was surprised by this because no tent or anything was at Site D the 2 times I walked past the site. I told him this, and he said he comes to the island a few times a year, and you have to book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he told me most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He also told me that he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods where he finds a place to camp. He said that one time he found the ruins of a small log house in those woods, and he's going to try and find it again and camp inside of it. At this point, I started to change my opinion about this guy and wanted to change the subject, but then he asked me if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I took a second to reply and knew he was talking about the squealing I had heard. I told him I had, and asked him if he knew what that was. This time, he took a second to reply and I saw his face change. He looked as if he was thinking if he should tell me something, like it was a secret. With no expression at all on his face, he said it matter-of-factly. A demon lives on this island. Under any other circumstance, I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night. I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell I had experienced something. At this point, I was ready for the conversation to be over. Then he told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really did not want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask it. So I asked him what he saw in the cemetery, but my voice was shaky. Then I could tell he had changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me that what he saw was somewhat hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises, he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without any context. Keepers of the Flame. I looked at my cigar, and the ash was long. I put it out and told him I was going to wait by the dock for the boat. He nodded, and I started to walk away. After a few steps, he said, "Hey," and I turned around to look at him. He said, "Don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if that was a warning or a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame as it pertained to Rock Island. I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then, there was also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time that called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails, and exploring Chester Thorderson's buildings. My humble suggestion is this: do not go to Rock Island. For hundreds of years, tourists and paranormal investigators have been baffled by the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. The owner, Charles Townshend, wed Dorothy Walpole, a young lady, back in the 1700s. For a while, they lived in Raynham Hall together contentedly. But Townshend soon developed a paranoia about his wife's infidelity. He ultimately chose to hide Dorothy away in the hallway and inform everyone of their friends and relatives that she had sadly passed away after driving himself insane with jealousy. Dorothy was only permitted to roam the mansion's halls while she was compelled to remain inside. She never left Raynham Hall after her husband imprisoned her, and she passed away soon after. People have reported seeing a woman in a ragged brown dress wandering the halls ever since she passed away, and some of these encounters are very terrifying. Unaware of the tale surrounding the brown lady, one of the visitors approached the woman in the hall, and she looked at him with a glowing face, but where her eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets. After countless sightings, and many years later, Raynham Hall was photographed for a feature by a photographer from Country Life magazine. He took a picture of the main stairs and noticed a blurry figure that many people think is none other than Dorothy Walpole, also known as the Brown Lady. It's been documented that the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall wanders the passages every Christmas. Legend has it that an eccentric woman haunts an old Victorian house. On Christmas Eve, a spectral group from the Stark family continues a tradition they started many years ago. Numerous sightings, especially around Christmas time, have been recorded by visitors to a Victorian property in Ludington, Michigan, which is said to be haunted by the souls of the Stark family. One such ghost, Vera Stark, seemed to have carried her oddities from this life into the next. As she did in life, many who have seen her spirit say she picks flowers in the front yard while wearing nothing but a fur coat. Some even claim to have seen the specter of a Stark daughter who tragically died in the gym of the estate as she wandered the hallways. The home's current owners said, "Our spirits did not care for it being open to the public and went wild" when asked about their plans to open the house to historical tours. Over the decades, many people have documented that Alcatraz Island is a very haunted place. Interestingly enough, there is a story about how an Alcatraz Christmas party was supposedly interrupted by a ghost. Even though the solitary penitentiary on San Francisco Bay in California, Alcatraz, shut down in 1963, the ghosts of the inmates who previously inhabited the island have haunted visitors and observers ever since. One of the most famous ghost encounters at Alcatraz, often referred to as the Rock, was told over Christmas. The prison has a reputation for unexplained and terrifying psychic experiences. While the institution was still running in the 1940s, Warden Johnston chose to have a modest Christmas celebration at his island boarding house. At one point during the assembly, some of the sentries started relating the tale of a ghostly form that had materialized, wearing a gray suit, brimmed cap, and sporting mutton chop sideburns. While the guards were frozen in shock, staring at the spectral apparition, the room suddenly turned very cold, and the fire in the Ben Franklin stove was extinguished. The specter disappeared as abruptly as he had emerged. On On Christmas Eve, Sir Geoffrey de Mondeville's spectre and his lifeless dog roamed the streets. There are several political betrayals in Sir Geoffrey de Mondeville's story. In the 11th century, he was a prominent European landowner who held the horrific Earl of Essex. He held considerable sway in the realm of royal politics due to his title. Nevertheless, he was excommunicated from the church and bequeathed a large portion of his wealth when a controversy arose over who should succeed to the throne. Many think that Sir Geoffrey's spirit became stuck in this world since he was killed on the battlefield during his excommunication and was not permitted a proper Christian burial. The rumor has it that Sir Geoffrey cursed the domains he possessed, saying that his betrayer would meet destruction if they were ever taken from him. Every 6 years on Christmas Eve, he and his headless dog dressed in a scarlet cloak would haunt the lands. Following his death, frequenters of the properties he owned, especially Pimsbrook Bridge and East Barnet, began reporting paranormal activity, including the emergence of a headless dog from the fog and the appearance of a knight clad in full armor and a red cloak. In England, there's a house known as the Bramshall House, and it is haunted by the legend of the Mistletoe Bride. For millennia, people have spun variations of the Mistletoe Bride legend. The disappearance of Lord Lovell's bride at Bramshall House in Hampshire, England, is thought by many to be the story's original source, though this is not confirmed. Bramshall House's owner, Sir John Cope, was said to be the young woman Lord Lovell was getting ready to marry. Since it was almost Christmas, mistletoe was draped throughout the mansion, which gave the wedding party an idea for a game. The young bride-to-be would disappear someplace in the mansion, and the groomsmen would search for her until they discovered her. The first person to find her would get to kiss her. The bridal party set out to locate the bride after she fled. Still, they were unable to locate her, as the minutes grew into hours. When she vanished, and they could find her nowhere, the game eventually became really serious. It took Lord Lovell 50 years to discover a hidden closet in an upper floor room of Bramshall House, while still looking for answers regarding his bride's abduction. He discovered a wooden trunk within that was locked shut. When he opened the chest, the almost indistinguishable remnants of his bride were within. A Brooklyn home was plagued by phantoms around Christmas. Edward F. Smith was at his Brooklyn, New York home a few weeks before Christmas 1878 when the doorbell rang. When he answered the door, nobody was home. The doorbell would ring every night, and Smith would always discover no one outside and no indication that anyone had been there at all. This eventually became a regular occurrence. Exhausted, Smith sprinkled ash and flour along the path to the door, expecting to find footprints left behind. But the substances were undisturbed, and the noises continued. The noises remained unidentified no matter where he and his family stood in the house. The doorbell was ringing non-stop, and Smith and his family were becoming increasingly alarmed. They eventually got in touch with the cops. Nothing could be found to explain the continuous ringing and thumping. One evening, a brick came flying in through the window from outside, despite the fact that cops were standing close by and could see nobody. Police spent a considerable amount of time investigating the house, but they were unable to determine what was causing the disruptions. Smith came to the conclusion that the bizarre events had to be of paranormal nature, as did many who witnessed them. Roos Hall is said to be haunted by a headless horseman every December. One of England's most haunted locations is said to be Roos Hall, a strange estate in the countryside. Since it was initially constructed in the 16th century, the mansion, which is situated in Suffolk County just outside the tiny town of Beccles, has amassed a considerable number of ghost stories. The Headless Horseman tale is amongst the most terrifying. Although this legend is well known to many, it takes on a life of its own at Roos Hall. A guy on a horse has been reported by many guests of Roos Hall, riding toward them on the road, only to find out later that he is headless. On Christmas Eve, the headless man is said to frequently be seen clattering down the driveway with his phantom coach and 4 horses. And this is just the start of Roos Hall's spectral life. Some have even reported seeing a girl observing the weird markings from the windows, which they refer to as the devil's footprints, according to other tales. It's said that Bastion Square in Victoria, British Columbia, is haunted by a Christmas ghost. Just as the clock was striking midnight, ushering in the joyous Christmas day, a misdeed as dark, cowardly, and mysterious as ever disfigured the history of this province was perpetuated, read a chilling story that ran on the front page of the Daily Colonist, a newspaper published in Victoria on December 25th, 1890. The target, a 21-year-old man going by the name David Fee, had been strolling after attending a costume party to meet his parents for evening mass at the neighboring church. Fee, wearing a white clown outfit, had just reached the cathedral's location when a man emerged from the shadows, pointing a double barrel straight at him. He said, quite simply, "You challenge me." The man shot Fee before he could say anything, and Fee died a short while later. It seems that the man mistook Fee for someone else. It's said that Fee's spirit has been haunting his tomb in the streets outside the cathedral ever since that fateful night. There is a legend that a murdered highwayman reappears every Christmas Eve. One particularly macabre ghost story from England refers to a terrible incident that happened on Christmas Eve in the late 1700s. Legend has it that there once was a dangerous highwayman who went by the name Gilbert, who would walk up and down one of the main routes in the town. Gilbert captured a guy and his daughter who were riding in a horse-drawn carriage one evening, the night before Christmas. The girl managed to get out of the carriage, but the horses were startled and ran off down the road with the guy and his coachman following before her father could get out. The man's daughter was left behind with Gilbert, and the 2 men battled to regain control over the horses so they could return and find her. But when they returned to the scene, she was nowhere to be seen. Rather, they found Gilbert crouched on the ground, a dagger embedded in his side. There is a rumor that as the bus drove away, Gilbert confessed to the girl that he had killed her brother sometime earlier. The discovery infuriated her, and she stabbed him before running from the scene. According to local lore, Gilbert was buried by the side of the road and is said to roam the same route on Christmas Eve, waiting for the coach carrying the man and his daughter to pass by once more. Every Christmas Eve, Anne Boleyn is rumored to return to her childhood home. Once home to the Boleyn family, Hever Castle is tucked away in the heart of Kent, a rural area in Britain. The most well-known member of the family, Anne Boleyn, spent her formative years there before being married to King Henry VIII. But within the castle, after a few short years of her marriage, Anne became the focus of dissension and rumors, which accused her of everything from infidelity to witchcraft. She was eventually put to death when her husband publicly accused her of committing these crimes. Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, is supposed to be haunted by her ghost, regardless of whether she is grieving or just homesick. But apparently, she only shows up on Christmas Eve, one day a year. There are rumors that her somber specter is seen drifting silently over the picturesque bridge that spans the River Eden and the grounds of the home where she knew much happiness. It's said that at the Hotel Bethlehem, a spectral socialite sings Christmas carols. A little girl named Myuu is the subject of one of the scariest ghost stories told about the Hotel Bethlehem in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Mary, also known as May, was raised on the stage and developed a passion of singing and performing at a young age. She was born in 1866. She received a lot of notice for her talent, and soon she was appearing on stages in Paris and other parts of Europe with considerable success. She even attracted the interest of a wealthy lord, who promptly wed her and elevated her to the status of British nobility. Unfortunately, her achievements put her in jeopardy. After the lord who had swept her off her feet went bankrupt, her marriage collapsed, and she later married an American soldier who embezzled much of her fortune. Reports at the time of her death stated that she considered her time in Bethlehem to be the happiest of her life. Guests of Hotel Bethlehem still report seeing ghosts of a young May Yohei, dressed elegantly, walking by the Christmas tree or singing at the piano. Some even assert that they heard her sing one of her favorite songs in a faint but identifiable voice. At the Crescent Hotel, boisterous revelers are said to usher in the season. Without a doubt, one of the most well-known haunted hotels in the US is the Crescent Hotel. Since it was originally built in the 1880s, the hotel, which is situated close to the Ozark National Forest on Arkansas's northern border, has been beset by tragedy and ghost stories. Though virtually every square inch of the hotel's grounds is linked to various folktales and apparition sightings, one tale still astounds guests today. One year, when guests arrived to see the hotel's Christmas tree, it is said that they discovered the Christmas tree and all its packages were mysteriously moved to the other side of the room. This might have been a prank by someone visiting the hotel or staff. However, there were reports of ghosts strolling the dining area of the establishment, some of them clothed in Victorian attire. Some claimed the spirits looked playful, jokingly moving the furniture and gifts across the room. The hotel workers apparently returned the following day and saw that everything had restored to its original location, which seemed to substantiate this. On Christmas Eve, it is said that the ghosts of Poland's kings gather in a dragon's den. Built in the early Middle Ages, the Wawel Castle is located in the center of Krakow, Poland, and has been the residence of every Polish king for centuries. Since then, it has been connected to a plethora of myths and ghost stories that date all the way back to prehistoric times. One such legend is a vast network of caves said to be beneath a local land parcel called Wawel Hill. Since their discovery centuries ago, these caves have been extensively examined, and there are rumors that within them lies a statue of a dragon and millennia of human record. It is thought that people have lived in the caverns from prehistoric times. According to legend, King Casimir, who was only a young boy when he investigated these caves in the 11th century, discovered an unusual tunnel. He stated to have discovered a big stone inside the tunnel that was shining, and the light was said to be releasing a protecting magical energy that spread over Krakow. Legends from the area still hold that on Christmas Eve, all of Poland's former monarchs gather in that tunnel to decide Krakow's fate. Three months ago, I went on vacation to Italy with my spouse and some friends. We were in a rather old and gloomy house with crucifixes, prie-dieu, all kinds of old things. When it came time to divide up the rooms, one of our friends who claims to be a psychic refused to take a particular room because of quote-unquote bad vibes. I didn't care, so we took it. After the third night, I was suddenly awakened. Something was tugging at my foot 2 times in a row. I wasn't afraid, but I was surprised. It felt a bit like a child playing or wanting to ask something. I told myself that I was dreaming, but the following night, I felt as if someone was resting gently on my legs. When I opened my eyes to see what was going on, I saw a little boy standing at the end of the bed. I was really scared, even though I didn't feel anything evil. I explained the whole thing to my psychic friend, who wanted to help me. She detected several spirits. According to her, the little boy even grabbed her arm, pulled her hair, and then went to another room. He just wanted to play. Nothing has happened since. Recently, however, strange things have been happening. I wake up several times for no reason at night with the feeling that something is wrong. Nothing bad, just I'm pulled from my sleep. Once again, I was awakened with the sensation that my foot was being pulled. And this is where it gets creepy. A week ago, my spouse was getting ready to leave in the morning. Half asleep, I felt a warm hug enveloping me, and I was happy that he was giving me a hug before leaving for work. Except that at the same time, I hear my spouse in the other room leaving and locking the door. Who the hell was hugging me? I was terrified. I turned on the lamp and I left the room. I calmed down and I wanted to go back to the room and turn off the lamp, but it was already off. But I clearly remember that I turned it on. Here's the story. I'm lost. I have so many questions. Is it possible that this ghost boy followed me? Why showing up 3 months later? Is he trying to tell me something? How do I know what he wants, or how do I help him? There is a place in Nova Scotia known locally as Little Girl's Grave. It is a gravestone of a young girl named Catherine McIntosh. She died of an illness and was originally buried in McLennan Cemetery. However, due to a dispute with a neighbor, her body was dug up and moved to the side of Greenville Road in front of the family farm. One night I went with 2 friends to visit the gravestone. It was a dark and gloomy night, driving down the eerie winding dirt road until we came upon the location. We brought a toy to leave at the gravestone. The local lore surrounding this site says to leave a toy for her and to never take a toy away. It wasn't until we left and began driving down the dirt road that we had a paranormal experience. We noticed on the front windshield in the condensation a small child's footprint on the glass. It was so detailed and human-like, it scared us quite a bit to say the least. One of the friends I had visited the gravesite with worked with me at the same restaurant at the time. A few days after we had visited the site, we were working together and we both heard something truly bizarre. It was the sound of a child laughing, very faintly. We both stared at each other in disbelief. We had no idea where the sound originated from whatsoever, as there was no one around except for the 2 of us. Not long after this, we had a falling out and have not spoken with each other since 2013. This is one of the only paranormal experiences that I've encountered in my life. If anyone who reads this has had any similar experiences at this gravestone, please share it with us. We moved about 4 months ago into a temporary place while we build our forever home. This is a older single wide trailer, probably from the 1980s, that has been updated inside. It's cheaper, so it helps with building expenses. Anyways, my son's room is on one end of the trailer and ours on the other. We frequently go to the bathroom throughout the night next to his room. Several times now, we have went to use the restroom and heard my son giggling and talking to himself. In complete darkness, by himself. Sometimes you can hear what he's saying. "That tickles. You're funny," etc. Now, my significant other says he has heard him around 3 to 4 a.m. most times. I've heard him around 5 to 6 a.m. My son stays with my ex-husband half the week. We have 50-50 custody. And when my son isn't here, we have heard things from his room. My significant other has heard giggles and muffled talking. Toys randomly come on. However, we always find logical reasons to dismiss it. We live next to a 24-hour gas station about 20 yards from my son's window, and figure it's people talking over there. Plus, we have 2 cats that may sneak in his room and knock toys on. That being said, this morning my son told me there is a boy in his room, and he tickles him. This totally has me freaked out. Backstory on my son. He's 5 years old and is diagnosed with autism. He was nonverbal until last year. We do struggle with complex conversations, so asking him to describe what he sees just doesn't work well yet. He is a very happy, loving child. Since moving, he seems to be acting the same, just these issues at night where he is awake, which is causing him to be sleepy during the day. So, is this a ghost? Imaginary friend? Just hoping someone has had a similar situation. Our home is projected to be done in September, so we will be here for several more months. During the pandemic, when that was very huge and everyone was in quarantine, 3 of my cousins came over to visit. They're on my Nana's side of the family. I live with my grandparents, and they are from Ohio. I remember when one of my cousins told me the story of how a ghost was in a photo a friend took of him. Basically, when my cousin was younger, he played with his siblings in the basement of his house a lot. They lived and still do live in a wonderful farmhouse. One time, he had one of his friends come over to play. While they were playing, his friend decided to take a photo of my cousin while they were on the stairs leading down into the basement. After he took the picture, he noticed that there was a black figure standing in the photo. We still have that photo. The story doesn't end here, though. There is a lake not too far away from where the farmhouse is. Years and years ago, there was a boy who drowned there tragically, so you probably see where this is going. I think that dark figure in the photo was the boy who drowned. He drowned at a young age, by the way, and it would also make sense because since he was young, the black figure could have been there trying to play. Heck, maybe the boy didn't even know he was dead, making this a Sixth Sense scenario.
Either way, this is just a theory. If I get the photo, I'll update this and include it. My wife and I moved into our old house in New England in summer of 2000. We had looked at dozens of houses, but this one just immediately felt like home. Soon after, we invited our good friend James and his husband up for a weekend. Keep James and his husband in mind. We were pretty well into getting our late night party on, playing cards, drinking, smoking in the dining room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw, very vividly, an older woman with jet black hair sitting next to the old upright piano in the corner. The piano came with the house. We specifically requested that the previous owner include it in the sale because it was so cool, and we didn't have much furniture. It wasn't even slightly scary. In fact, it was just like she was hanging out. I mentioned it to everyone and we laughed it off. Drinking and fun continued through the night. I was never really a ghost believer and still a skeptic 100%, but the rest of the story really makes me wonder. Several weeks later, we met a neighbor from down the street who lived in the neighborhood for 45 years. "You live in the Muriel King house," she tells us. Muriel was a really interesting lady. She was a famous fashion designer in the 1930s that lived there alone after her husband committed suicide. Very tragic, but she was an interesting lady, very independent and ahead of her time. She traveled all over the world. She was Greek, I think. Greek? I ask. Weird question, but did she have black hair? Yes, she had jet black hair even when she was an old woman. It was very striking. Yep, I got the chills right then. Many weeks later, I met another neighbor from down the street that had lived there for 60 plus years, and he starts telling me about Muriel. She was a famous fashion designer. She designed gowns for Rita Hayworth and all the classic film stars, and she designed costumes for Broadway plays too. Her parties were legendary, he tells me. She used to have all her gay boyfriends from Broadway come up on the train and they'd drink and sing show tunes at the piano in the dining room all night long. Yup, now this could all be coincidental, but it just seems too much to be so. But she must have been an awesome woman. People from around the town have given us some of her original drawings and even an unfinished dress she was working on. There haven't been any more Muriel sightings, but shortly after my wife got pregnant, about 20 years ago, we both awoke up out of a cold sleep at the same time and looked at each other like, what the fuck? And then our bedroom door slammed. Hard. We like to think that Muriel wasn't a fan of kids. She never had any of her own. So she was like, "Later y'all, I'm out of here." Other than that, nothing's really happened that's given us the chills. I mean, it's more in a good way, like she might hide my keys whenever I smoke too much weed or get drunk. Now, let's take this back to 2007. I was like 8 years old, and I was living in a small town. I lived super close to all my friends who were my neighbors, and we would ride our bikes up and down the street. It was a summer morning when I decided to ask my mom if I could go next door to get my friends to ride bikes with me. She said yes, of course, so I went outside and grabbed my bike and started walking up the hill to knock on my friend's door. As I was walking up with my bike, I saw a girl, around my age at the time, standing at the top of the hill that I was walking up to. She was skinny, long blonde hair, and was wearing what seemed to be PJs. She was pretty far away from me, but I didn't mind her since I didn't know who she was. I kept walking, and all of a sudden I hear a car coming from the other side of the hill. As I hear the car getting closer, I start yelling at her to move. She would not budge. I start running towards her with my bike and kept yelling at her. She still would not move. At that point, the car had gotten so close that I closed my eyes. The car eventually drove past me and I opened my eyes to see that she was gone. I ran up the rest of the way to see if she may have gotten out of the way in time, but when I got there, she was gone. My boyfriend, my dog, and I just moved cross-country into a very old town with a dark history. We were renting a home, and since day one I've felt uneasy about the basement. My dog has had extremely abnormal behavior whenever going into the basement as well. While staring into the room that makes my hair stand up, he began urinating, no squat or anything, before running up the stairs and refusing to come down for several days. Anytime I have to go down, it's a sickening feeling and an overwhelming fight or flight response. I've seen a tall shadow multiple times, doors in the basement opening and slamming, and so much more. Where do I go from here? I'm uncomfortable being in my own home. I'd love to know the history of the house if there's anything, but I don't know where to start. Any advice welcome. There's much more if anyone wants more information. I'm most worried about whatever darkness is in the basement. Update. December 28, 2022. Thank you, everyone. I feel like with each passing day, things become more unreal. I've set up 2 cameras, one in the basement and one in the hallway leading to the basement. I've read so much about orbs not being much proof, but the camera in the hallway has caught orbs at 4 a.m. only most nights. We also discovered the house has been cleansed previously with sage oil and crosses above every doorway, windows, and mirrors except in the basement. I've spoken with several very spiritual people and they recommended salt, sage, and blessing the home. I have placed salt down and I was gifted sage, but I don't believe it is a good idea for me to use it, especially because at this time I lack the courage to face whomever is taking up our space confidently. I have contacted a local church to see about having the home blessed. I have been using positive affirmations to help keep positive energy upstairs. It is a small town and has been difficult to track down the records, but so far I've learned of an officer who may have passed away in the home in 1967. I've lived on this property all my life with my parents, and now on the same property my husband and I have a home together. All my life since I've lived here, I've seen and heard things of the paranormal phenomena. Decades ago, someone was doing excavating work working in a bobcat, and the ground started sinking too much. The equipment fell in, burying him alive. A historian told us years ago that Native Americans once resided in this property as well. I cannot remember which tribe, but I'm sure a mix of that, plus maybe some other stuff we're not aware of, play a role in the paranormal experiences that happen on this place. Here's a good one for you. When my husband and I first got our new home built here back in 2016, where the previous trailer sat, he was in the shower, and after he came out, he asked me why I would mess with him like that when he's in the shower and he could have fallen. He doesn't have a right foot from below the knee down. I was very confused and asked what he meant. He said, "You touched my butt through the curtain and grabbed the butt cheek." I seriously did not do that. I wouldn't do anything to make him fall and hurt him, so something definitely grabbed his butt cheek in the shower. There's other things that have happened here too. When I was a teenager, I was laying in bed in my room watching TV with the lights off since it was late and I was trying to go to sleep. All of a sudden, a huge black blob flew across the top of my room, appearing at the one corner above the TV and then went to the other side, disappearing into the ceiling the same way it appeared. I was very scared that night and felt so uneasy. I only saw that happen one at a time, and it was months later, and it was about half the size of the first one. After that, I never saw it again. This leads me to today's story. Just recently, I was asleep in bed when I was woken up by what I thought was my husband throwing his leg over me in the middle of him sleeping. I pushed his leg off me, and I felt someone roll over in the bed. I rolled over a little more to snuggle him just to realize there's nobody in bed with me. I looked to see where my dogs were. They're beagle mixes, so small dogs, not anywhere the size of a human. One is on a pillow, sound asleep. Another is at the foot of the bed, and another is in front of the fan since she likes it, and another one is to my left. The other 3 dogs are out in the living room with my husband, who is sound asleep on the couch. Of course, he fell asleep watching football, but then I realized the time was 3:30 in the morning, and I said, "Man, I don't feel like dealing with this right now. I'm going back to sleep." So I rolled back over and went back to sleep. I just want to say, though, that stuff like this just doesn't bother me or faze me much anymore since I basically experienced it all my life.